Hello, everyone, and today we're going to continue reading Maurice Cornforth's Materialism and the Dialectical Method. We'll be reading chapters 5 and 6. So we'll begin with chapter 5, the dialectical conception of development, the idea of evolution. We have seen that the corrections of the mechanistic standpoint made by the dialectical materialism are fully justified by and have a basis in the advance of science. Indeed, the advance of science itself has shattered the whole conception of the universe held by the older mechanistic materialists. According to that conception, the universe always remained much the same. It was a huge machine which always did the same things, kept grinding out the same products, went on in a perpetual cycle of the same processes. Thus, it used to be thought that the stars in the solar system always remained the same, and that the Earth, with its continents and oceans and the plants and animals inhabiting them, likewise always remained the same. But this conception has given way to the conception of evolution, which has invaded all spheres of investigation without exception. Science, however, does not advance in isolation from society as a whole, and the widespread application of the idea of evolution was due not simply to its verification in scientific theory, but also to its popularity with the new, rising forces of industrial capitalism, themselves the patrons of science. The bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production, and thereby the relations of production, and with them the whole relations of society. Conservation of the old modes of production in unaltered form was, on the contrary, the first condition of existence of all earlier industrial classes. Constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguish the bourgeois epoch from all earlier ones. And that is from Marx and Engels in the Communist, or the Manifesto of the Communist Party. The industrial capitalists saw themselves as the bearers of progress, and as they thought progress was the law of capitalism, so they saw it as the law of the whole universe. So there was made possible a great advance in the scientific picture of the universe. We find developing a picture of the universe, not as static, as always the same, but as in continual progressive development. The stars did not always exist. They were formed out of masses of dispersed gas. Once formed, the whole stellar system, with all the stars in it, goes through an evolutionary process stage by stage. Some stars, like our sun, acquire planets, a solar system. Thus, the Earth was born. As its surface cooled, so chemical compounds were formed, impossible in the high temperatures of the stars. Thus, matter began to manifest new properties, non-existent before, the properties of chemical combination. Then, organic compounds were formed out of the complex linking of carbon atoms, and from organic matter, the first bodies arose, which began to manifest the properties of life, of living matter. Still new properties of matter emerged, the properties of living matter. Living organisms went through a long evolution, leading eventually to man. With man, human society was born, and still new processes with new laws arose, the laws of society, and the laws of thought. What comes next? Capitalist science can go no further. Here it ends, since capitalist science cannot contemplate the ending of capitalism. But socialist science shows that man himself is about to embark on a new phase of evolution, communist society, in which the whole social progress will be brought under his own conscious, planned direction. All this is evolutionary history of the material universe. Apart from the last point, it may be said this is all common knowledge. Bourgeois thinkers know this as well as Marxists, though they often forget it. But Marxism does not only stress the fact that everything in the world goes through a process of development. What Marxism found out was how to understand and explain this development in a materialist way. Marxist scientific discoveries about the laws of development of society were made by applying the conceptions of materialist dialectics. That is why Marxism alone is able to give a fully scientific account of development and to point out the future path. Marx demonstrated how to understand all change and development in nature and in society in a materialist way, and therefore how to become masters of the future. Idealist conceptions of change and development. How did bourgeois thinkers try to account for the universal change and development which they discovered? Let us consider what some of them have had to say over a period of more than a century. Hegel said that the whole process of development taking place in history was due to the absolute idea realizing itself in history. Herbert Spencer said that all development was a process of increasing integration of matter. And he put this down to what he called an incomprehensible and omnipresent power. Henry Bergson said that everything was in process of evolution due to the activity of the life force. Fairly recently, a school of British philosophers has coined the phrase emergent evolution. They pointed out that in the course of development, new qualities of matter are continually emerging one after the other. But as to why this should happen, one of the leaders of this school, Professor Samuel Alexander, said that it was inexplicable and must be accepted with natural piety. While another of its leaders, Professor C. Lloyd Morgan, said that it must be due to some immanent force at work in the world, which he identified with God. Thus, in every case, some fantasy, something inexplicable and unpredictable was conjured up to explain development. And so, when they thought about the future, all these bourgeois philosophers of evolution either thought, like Hegel, that development had now finished. Hegel taught that the absolute idea was fully realized in the Prussian state, of which he was a distinguished employee, or else regarded the future as unfathomable. Nowadays, they begin to give up hope altogether and regard everything, past, present, and future, as incomprehensible, the result of forces no one can ever understand or control. A second defect in the evolutionary ideas of most bourgeois thinkers is that they regard the process of evolution as a smooth, continuous, and unbroken process. They see the process of transition from one evolutionary stage to another as taking place through a series of gradations, without conflict and without any break in continuity. But continuity is not the law of development. On the contrary, periods of smooth, continuous evolutionary development are interrupted by sudden and abrupt changes. The emergence of the new stage in development takes place when the conditions for it have matured, by a break in continuity, by the leap from one state to another. Hegel was the first to point this out. With every period of transition, he observed, "It is, as in the case of the birth of a child, after a long period of nutrition and silence, the continuity of the gradual growth in size, of quantitative change, is suddenly cut short by the first breath drawn. There is a break in the process, a qualitative change, and the child is born." And that is from Hegel's Phenomenology of the Mind. But Marx alone followed up this profound observation of Hegel. As for the ensuing bourgeois thinkers, although the investigations of science and common experience itself clearly demonstrate that development cannot take place without discontinuity, without abrupt transitions and the leap from one state to another, they have nevertheless, in their general theories, tried to make unbroken continuity the law of evolution. This prejudice in favor of a smooth line of evolution has gone hand in hand with the liberal belief that capitalist society will evolve smoothly, through orderly bourgeois progress broadening down from precedent to precedent, as Tennyson once explained it. To have thought differently about evolution in general would have implied that we would have to think differently about social evolution in particular. The dialectical materialist conception of development. The problem of understanding and explaining development in a materialist way, that is, in harmony with the facts conceived in their own and not in a fantastic connection, is answered by dialectical materialism. Dialectical materialism considers the universe not as static, not as unchanging, but as in continual process development. It considers this development not as a smooth, continuous, and an unbroken process, but as a process in which phases of gradual evolutionary change are interrupted by breaks in continuity, by the sudden leap from one state to another. And it seeks for the explanation, the driving force of this universal movement, not in inventions of idealist fantasy, but within material processes themselves, in the inner contradictions, the opposite conflicting tendencies, which are in operation in every process of nature and society. The main ideas of materialist dialectics, which are applied in dealing with the laws of development of the real material world, including society, will be the subject of the following chapters. But this is how Lenin summed them up in his philosophical notebooks. The essential idea of materialist dialectics is The recognition of the contradictory, mutually exclusive, opposite tendencies in all phenomena and processes of nature. This alone furnishes the key of the self-movement of everything in existence. It alone furnishes the key to the leaps, to the break in continuity, to the transformation into the opposite, to the destruction of the old and emergence of the new. It is proper meaning. Dialectics is the study of the contradiction within the very essence of things. Development is the struggle of opposites. Where contradiction is at work, there is the force of development. This materialist understanding of dialectics is the key to understanding the forces of development within the material world itself, without recourse to outside causes. This discovery arises from the whole advance of science and philosophy. But above all, it arises from the investigation of the laws of society, an investigation made imperative thanks to the very development of society, from the discovery of the contradictions of capitalism, explaining the forces of social development, and thereby showing the way forward from capitalism to socialism. That is why bourgeois thinkers could not answer the problem of explaining the real material forces of development in nature and society. To answer this problem was to condemn the capitalist system. Here they had a blind spot. Only the revolutionary philosophy of the vanguard of the revolutionary class, the working class, could do it. Marx's discovery of the laws of materialist dialectics showed us how to understand the dialectical development of nature. But above all, it showed us how to understand social change and how to wage the working class struggle for socialism. This discovery revolutionized philosophy. It signalized the triumph of materialism over idealism by doing away with the limitations of the merely mechanistic materialism of the past. It likewise spelled the end of all systems of philosophy. It made philosophy into a revolutionary weapon of the working people, an instrument, a method for understanding the world so as to change it. And that is the end of part 1, materialism. We will now get into part 2, dialectics. Starting with chapter 6, dialectics and metaphysics. The metaphysical way of thinking. We have seen how the materialist explanation is opposed to the idealist explanation, and then we saw how materialists formerly interpreted things in a mechanist way, but how mechanistic materialism proved inadequate to explain real processes of change and development. For this we need materialist dialectics. We need to study and understand things dialectically. The dialectical method is, indeed, nothing but the method of studying and understanding things in their real change and development. As such, it stands opposed to metaphysics. What is metaphysics? Or more exactly, what is the metaphysical way of thinking, which is opposed by the dialectical way of thinking? Metaphysics is essentially an abstract way of thinking. In a sense, all thinking is abstract, since it works with general concepts and cannot but disregard a great deal of particular and unessential detail. For example, if we say that men have 2 legs, we are thinking of the two-leggedness of men in abstraction from their other properties, such as having a head, 2 arms, and so on. And similarly, we are thinking of all men in general, disregarding the individuality of particular men. But there is abstraction and abstraction. Metaphysical abstraction consists of thinking as though what is abstracted could exist in abstraction. The art of right thinking involves learning how to avoid metaphysical abstraction. Suppose, for example, we are thinking about men, about human nature. Then we should think about human nature in such a way that we recognize that men live in society, and that their human nature cannot be independent of their living in society, but develops and changes with the development of society. We shall then form ideas about human nature which correspond to the actual condition of men's existence, and to their change and development. But yet people often think about human nature in a very different way, as though there were such a thing as human nature which manifested itself quite independent of the actual conditions of human existence, and which was always and everywhere exactly the same. To think in such a way is obviously to think in a misleadingly abstract way, and it is just such a misleadingly abstract way of thinking that we call metaphysics. The concept of fixed, unchanging human nature is an example of metaphysical abstraction, of the metaphysical way of thinking. The metaphysician does not think in terms of real men, but of man in the abstract. Metaphysics, or the metaphysical way of thinking, is then that way of thinking which thinks of things, 1, an abstraction from their conditions of existence, and 2, an abstraction from their change and development. It thinks of things, 1, in separation from one from another, ignoring their interconnections, and 2, as fixed and frozen, ignoring their change and development. One example of metaphysics has already been given. It is not difficult to find plenty more. Indeed, the metaphysical way of thinking is so widespread and has become so much part and parcel of current bourgeois ideology that there is hardly an article in a journal, a television discussion, or a book by a learned professor in which examples of metaphysical fallacy are not to be found. A good deal is said and written, for example, about democracy. But the speakers and writers usually refer to some pure or absolute democracy, which they seek to define in abstraction from the actual development of society, of classes, and of class struggle. But there can be no such pure democracy. It is a metaphysical abstraction. If we want to understand democracy, we have always to ask, democracy for whom? For the exploiters or the exploited? We have to understand that since democracy is a form of government, there is no democracy which is not associated with the rule of some particular class, and that the democracy which is established when the working class is the ruling class is a higher form of democracy than capitalist democracy, just as capitalist democracy is a higher form of democracy than, say, the slave owners' democracy of ancient Greece. In other words, we should not try to think of democracy in abstraction from real social relations and from the real change and development of society. Again, up to recently, most British children were regularly subjected to intelligence tests. It was alleged that each child possessed a certain fixed quantity of intelligence, which could be estimated without regard to the actual conditions of the child's existence, and which determined his capabilities throughout the whole of his life regardless of whatever conditions for change and development might subsequently come his way. This is another example of metaphysics. In this case, the metaphysical conception of intelligence was used as an excuse for denying educational opportunities to the majority of children on the grounds that their intelligence was too low for them to benefit from such opportunities. In general, metaphysics is a way of thinking which tries to fix the nature, properties, and potentialities of everything it considers once and for all. It presupposes that each thing has a fixed nature and fixed properties. And it thinks in terms of things rather than processes. It tries to sum up everything in a formula, which says that the whole world, or any part of the world which is under consideration, consists of just such and such things with such and such properties. Such a formula we may call a metaphysical formula. In philosophy, metaphysics often means the search for the ultimate constituents of the universe. Thus, the materialists, who said that the ultimate constituents were small, solid, material particles, were just as much metaphysicians as the idealists, who said that the ultimate constituents were spirits. All such philosophers thought they could sum up the ultimate nature of the universe in some formula. Some have had this formula, some that, but all have been metaphysicians. Yet it has been a hopeless quest. We cannot sum up the whole infinite changing universe in any such formula. And the more we find out about it, the more is this evident. It should now be clear that the mechanistic materialism, which we discussed in the preceding chapters, can equally well be called metaphysical materialism. We may also note in passing that certain philosophers today, the so-called positivists, who say we have no right to assert that anything exists except our own sense perceptions, claim to be against metaphysics because they claim to reject any philosophy which seeks for the ultimate constituents of the universe. For them, metaphysics means any theory which deals with ultimates, not verifiable in sense experience. By using the term in this way, they conceal the fact that they themselves are, if anything, more metaphysical than any other philosophers. For their own mode of thinking reaches extremes of metaphysical abstraction. What could be more metaphysical than to imagine, as the positivists philosophers do, that our sense experience exists in abstraction from the real material world outside us? Indeed, they themselves make sense experience into a metaphysical ultimate. In opposition to the abstract metaphysical way of thinking, dialectics teaches us to think of things in their real changes and interconnections. To think dialectically is to think concretely, and to think concretely is to think dialectically. When we oppose the dialectical method to metaphysics, then we show up the inadequacy, one-sidedness, or falsity of the abstractions of metaphysics. This consideration enables us to understand the original meaning of the term dialectics. The word is derived from the Greek dialego, meaning to discuss or debate. It was considered that to discuss a question from all sides and from all angles, allowing different one-sided points of view to oppose and contradict each other during the debate, was the best method of arriving at the truth. Such was the dialectics employed, for example, by Socrates. When anyone claimed to have a formula which answered some question once and for all, Socrates would enter into discussion with him and, by forcing him to consider the question from different angles, would compel him to contradict himself and so to admit that his formula was false. By this method, Socrates considered that it was possible to arrive at more adequate ideas about things. The Marxist dialectical method develops from and includes dialectics in the sense in which it was understood by the Greeks, but it is far richer in content, far wider in its scope. As a result, it becomes something qualitatively new as compared with pre-Marxist dialectics, a new revolutionary method. For it is combined with a consistent materialism and ceases to be a mere method of argument, becoming a method of investigation applicable to both nature and society, a method of materialist understanding of the world which grows out of and guides the activity of changing the world. The metaphysical either-or. Metaphysics presupposes that each thing has its own fixed nature, its own fixed properties, and considers each thing by itself in isolation. It tries to settle the nature and properties of each thing as a given, separate object of investigation, not considering things in their interconnection and in their change and development. Because of this, metaphysics thinks of things in terms of hard and fast antithesis. It opposes things of one sort to things of another sort. If a thing is of one sort, it has one set of properties. If of another sort, it has another set of properties. The one excludes the other, and each is thought of in separation from the other. Thus, Engels writes in his introduction to Anti-Düring, "To the metaphysician, things and their mental images, ideas are isolated to be considered one after the other, apart from each other, rigid, fixed objects of investigation given once and for all. He thinks in absolutely irreconcilable antitheses. His communication is yea, yea, nay, nay, for whatever is more than these cometh of evil. For him a thing either exists or it does not exist. It is equally impossible for a thing to be itself and at the same time something else." Philosophers have expressed the essence of this metaphysical way of thinking in the formula, "Each thing is what it is and not another thing." This may sound no more than plain common sense, but that only shows that so-called common sense itself conceals misleading ideas which need to be brought into the open. This way of thinking prevents us from studying things in their real changes and interconnections, and all their contradictory aspects and relationships, and their process of changing form from one thing into another thing. It is not only philosophers who are metaphysicians. There are left-wing trade unionists, for example, who are as metaphysical as any school of philosophers. For them, everyone at their trade union branch meeting is either a class-conscious militant or else he is a right-wing opportunist. Everyone must fit into one or other category, and once he is down as right-wing, he is finished so far as they are concerned. That some worker who has been their opponent in the past and on some issues may yet prove an ally in the future and on other issues is not allowed for in their metaphysical outlook on life. One of Molière's plays, there is a man who learns for the first time about prose. When they explain to him what prose is, he exclaims, "Why, I've been speaking prose all my life." Similarly, there are many workers who may well say, "Why, I've been a metaphysician all my life." The metaphysician has his formula ready for everything. He says either this formula fits or it does not. If it does, that settles it. If it does not, then he has some alternative formula ready. Either or, but not both, is his motto. A thing is either this or that. It has either this set of properties or that set of properties. Two things stand to one another either in relationship or in that. The use of the metaphysical either or leads people into countless difficulties. For example, difficulties are felt in understanding the relations between American and British imperialism today. For it is argued, either they are working together or else they are not. If they are working together, then there is no rift between them. If there is a rift between them, then they are not working together. But on the contrary, they are working together and yet there are rifts between them. And we cannot understand the way they work together nor fight them effectively unless we understand the rifts which divide them. Again, difficulties are felt in understanding the possibility of the peaceful coexistence of capitalist and socialist states. For it is argued, either they can coexist peacefully, in which case antagonism between capitalism and socialism must cease, or else the antagonism remains, in which case they cannot coexist peacefully. But on the contrary, the antagonism remains, and yet the striving of the socialist states and of millions of people in all countries for peace can lead to peaceful relations between capitalist and socialist states. It is often difficult to avoid a metaphysical way of thinking, and this is because, misleading as it is, it yet has its roots in something very necessary and useful. It is necessary for us to classify things, to have some system of classifying them and assigning their properties and relations. That is a prerequisite of clear thinking. We have to work out what different kinds of things there are in the world to say that these have these properties as distinct from those which have those other properties, and to say what are their relations. But when we go on to consider these things and properties and relations each in isolation, as fixed constants, as mutually exclusive terms, then we begin to go wrong. For everything in the world has many different and indeed contradictory aspects, exists in intimate relationship with other things and not in isolation, and is subject to change. And so it frequently happens that when we classify something as A and not B, then this formula is upset by its changing from A to B, or by its being A in some relationships and B in others, or by having a contradictory nature, part A and part B. For example, we all know the difference between birds and mammals, and that while birds lay eggs, mammals in general produce their young alive and suckle them. Naturalists used to believe that mammals were rigidly distinguished from birds because, amongst other things, mammals do not lay eggs. But this formula was completely upset when an animal called the platypus was discovered, for while the platypus is undoubtedly a mammal, it is a mammal which lays eggs. What is the explanation of this irregular behavior of the platypus? Is it to be found in the evolutionary relationship of birds and mammals, which are both descended from original egg-laying animals? The birds have continued to lay eggs while the mammals stopped doing so, except for a few conservative animals like the platypus. If we think of animals in their evolution, their development, this appears very natural. But if we try, as the older naturalists tried, to make them fit into some rigid, fixed scheme of classification, then the products of evolution upset that classification. Again, an idea or a theory which was progressive in one set of circumstances, when it first arose, cannot for that reason be labeled progressive in an absolute sense, since it may later become reactionary in new circumstances. For instance, mechanistic materialism, when it first arose, was a progressive theory, but we cannot say that it is still a progressive today. On the contrary, under the new circumstances which has arisen, mechanistic theory has become retrograde, reactionary. Mechanism, which was progressive in the rising phase of capitalism, goes hand in hand with idealism as part of the ideology of capitalism in decay. Common sense, too, recognizes the limitations of metaphysical way of thinking. For example, when is a man bald? Common sense recognizes that though we can distinguish bald men from non-bald men, nevertheless baldness develops through a process of losing one's hair, and therefore men in the midst of this process enter into a phase in which we cannot say absolutely either that they are bald or that they are not. They are in process of becoming bald. The metaphysical either-or breaks down. In all these examples, we are confronted with the distinction between an objective process in which something undergoes change and the concepts in terms of which we try to sum up the characteristics of the things involved in the process. Such concepts never do and never can always and in all respects correspond to their objects, precisely because the objects are undergoing change. Engels explained this in a letter dated March 12, 1895, to a certain Mr. C. Schmidt, who was puzzled by it. Are the concepts that prevail in natural science fictions because they by no means always coincide with reality? From the moment we accept the theory of evolution, all our concepts of organic life correspond only approximately to reality. Otherwise, there would be no change. On the day that concept and reality absolutely coincide in the organic world, development is at an end. And he pointed out that similar considerations apply to all concepts without exception. The unity and struggle of opposites. When we think of the properties of things, their relationships, their modes of action and interaction, the processes into which they enter, then we find that, generally speaking, all these properties, relationships, interactions, and processes divide into fundamental opposites. For example, if we think of the simplest ways in which two bodies can act on one another, then we find that this action is either repulsion or attraction. If we consider the electrical properties of bodies, then there is positive and negative electricity. In organic life, there is the building up of organic compounds and the breaking of them down. Again, in mathematics, there is addition and subtraction, plus and minus. And in general, whatever sphere of inquiry we may be considering, we find that it involves such fundamental opposites. We find ourselves considering not just a number of different things, different properties, different relations, different processes, but pairs of opposites, fundamental oppositions. As Hegel put it, in opposition, the different is not confronted by any other but by its other. And that is from Encyclopedia of Philosophical Sciences, Logic, section 119. Thus, if we think of the forces acting between two bodies, there are not just a number of different forces, but they divide into attractive and repulsive forces. If we think of electric charges, there are not just a number of different charges, but they divide into positive and negative, and so on. Attraction stands opposed to repulsion, positive electricity to negative electricity. Such fundamental oppositions are not understood by the metaphysical way of thinking. In the first place, the metaphysical way of thinking tries to ignore and discount opposition. It seeks to understand a given subject matter simply in terms of a whole number of different properties and different relations of things, ignoring the fundamental oppositions which are manifested in these properties and relations. Thus, those who think in metaphysical terms about class-divided societies, for example, try to understand society as consisting merely of a large number of different individuals connected together by all kinds of different social relations. But they ignore the fundamental opposition of exploiters and exploited, manifested in all those social relations. In the second place, when the metaphysical way of thinking does nevertheless come upon the fundamental oppositions and cannot ignore them, then, true to its habit of thinking of each thing in isolation as a fixed constant, it considers these opposites each in isolation from the other, understands them separately and as each excluding the other. Thus, for example, the older physicists used to think of positive and negative electricity just simply as two different electrical fluids. But contrary to metaphysics, not only are fundamental opposites involved in every subject matter, but these opposites mutually imply each other, are inseparably connected together, and far from being exclusive, neither can exist or be understood except in relation to the other. This characteristic of opposition is known as polarity. Fundamental opposites are polar opposites. A magnet, for example, has two poles, a north pole and a south pole. But these poles, opposite and distinct, cannot exist in separation. If the magnet is cut in two, there is not a north pole in one half and south pole in the other half, but north and south poles recur in each half. The north pole exists only as the opposite of the south, and vice versa. The one can be defined only as the opposite of the other. In general, fundamental opposition has to be understood as polar opposition, and every subject matter has to be understood in terms of the polar opposition involved in it. Thus, in physics, we find that attraction and repulsion are involved in every physical process in such a way that they cannot be separated or isolated the one from the other. In considering living bodies, we do not find in some cases the building up of organic compounds, and in other cases, their breaking down. But every life process involves both the building up and the breaking down of organic compounds. In capitalist society, the increasing socialization of labor is inseparable from its opposite, the increasing centralization of capital. This unity of opposites, the fact that opposites cannot be understood in separation from one another, but only in their inseparable connection in every field of investigation, is strikingly exemplified in mathematics. Here the fundamental operations are the two oppositions, addition and subtraction. And so far is it from being the case that addition and subtraction can be understood each apart from the other, that addition can be represented as subtraction and vice versa. Thus the operation of subtraction, a minus b, can be represented as addition, negative b plus a. Similarly, a division of a divided by b can be represented as a multiplication of a times 1 divided by b. And that is Engel's Dialectics of Nature, Notes on Mathematics. The unity of opposites, their inseparable connection, is by no means to be understood as a harmonious and stable relationship, as a state of equilibrium. On the contrary, the unity of opposites is conditional, temporary, transitory, relative. The struggle of mutually exclusive opposites is absolute, just as development and motion are absolute. And that is Lenin Philosophical Notebooks. The existence of fundamental polar oppositions, manifesting themselves in every department of nature and society, expresses itself in the conflict and struggle of opposed tendencies, which, despite phases of temporary equilibrium, lead to continual motion and development, to a perpetual coming into being and passing away of everything in existence, to sharp changes of state and transformations. Thus, for example, the equilibrium of attractive and repulsive forces in the physical world is never more than conditional and temporary. The conflict and struggle of attraction and repulsion always asserts itself, issuing in physical changes and transformations, whether transformations on an atomic scale, changing or chemical changes, or on a grand scale, the explosion of stars. Dialectics and metaphysics. To sum up, metaphysics thinks in terms of ready-made things, whose properties and potentialities it seeks to fix and determine once and for all. It considers each thing by itself, in isolation from every other, in terms of irreconcilable antitheses, either or. It contrasts one thing to another, one property to another, one relationship to another, not considering things in their real movement and interconnection, and not considering that every subject matter represents a unity of opposites, opposed but inseparably connected together. Contrary to metaphysics, dialectics refuses to think of things each by itself as having a fixed nature and fixed properties, either or, but it recognizes that things come into being, exist, and cease to be in a process of unending change and development, in a process of complicated and ever-changing interrelationship, in which each thing exists only in its connection with other things, and goes through a series of transformations, and in which is always manifested the unity, inseparable interconnection and struggle of the opposite properties, aspects, tendencies, characteristic of every phenomenon of nature and society. Contrary to metaphysics, the aim of dialectics is to trace the real changes and interconnections in the world and to think of things always in their motion and interconnection. Thus, Engels writes in Ludwig Feuerbach, "The world is not to be comprehended as a complex of ready-made things, but as a complex of processes. One no longer permits oneself to be imposed upon by the antitheses insuperable of the old metaphysics." And also in Anti-Düring, "The old rigid antitheses, the sharp impassable dividing lines, are more and more disappearing. The recognition that these antitheses and distinctions are in fact to be found in nature, but only with relative validity, and that on the other hand their imagined rigidity and absoluteness have been introduced into nature only by our minds. This recognition is the kernel of the dialectical conception of nature." Dialectics grasps things and their images, ideas, essentially in their interconnection, in their sequence, their movement, their birth and death. Lenin wrote in his philosophical notebooks that the understanding of the contradictory parts of every phenomenon was the essence of dialectics. It consists in the recognition, discovery, of the contradictory, mutually exclusive, opposite tendencies in all phenomena and processes of nature, including mind and society. Lastly, Marx in the preface to Capital wrote that dialectic in its rational form is a scandal, an abomination to bourgeoisdom and its doctrinaire professors because it includes in its comprehension and affirmation recognition of the existing state of things, at the same time also the recognition of the negation of that state, of its inevitable breaking up, because it regards every historically developed social form as in fluid movement, and therefore takes into account its transient nature, not less than its momentary existence, because it lets nothing impose upon it, and is in its essence critical and revolutionary. So that was chapters 5 and 6 of Materialism and the Dialectical Method. Here we can see that we ended part 1, Materialism, and got into the first chapter of part 2, Dialectics, and we can see the two oppositions from each other now. So Materialism, its opposite is ideology, idealism, and then Dialectics, its opposite is metaphysics. Now we've read the first 5 chapters. We can see those distinctions between materialism and idealism, and how materialism actually deals with the actual physical properties of the universe, whereas idealism deals with things we can't see, forces beyond the physical conception, which of course is not true. And dialectics is in opposition to metaphysics, where metaphysics sees things as either or, as we saw, as things that are unchanging, and dialectics shows the changes as well as the interconnections between everything. I'm especially glad he brought up that argument, the nature of man. That is one that we often hear a lot, and I'd never really thought of it in a metaphysical sense. I never really believed in that argument, the nature of mankind often being referred to as selfish or being greedy, especially in today's capitalist society. But I always took the nature of man as to be adaptiveness, so to speak. That man will adapt to whatever structure he is in, whatever environment he is in. So it's easy for capitalists or class traders, essentially at this point, to point out and say, well, it's just the nature of mankind, it's the nature of humans to be selfish and greedy, and that's why capitalist society is the best. But really, the nature of man is to adapt to be able to survive in any environment. So the reason that we see people being selfish and greedy is because that's the environment we're in where they can get ahead. If we had an environment where not being selfish and greedy would get them ahead, that would be the nature of man. But it's not. It's adaptiveness, and as we've seen, it is constantly changing. So that is chapters 5 and 6. I just wanted to briefly touch on that. Sorry it took me 3 weeks. It's been very, very busy for me. It's going to continue to be very, very busy for me. I'm going to try and upload as often as I can. But if you like this content, please share, especially to those that might be interested in Marxism or communism. This is pretty much the introduction to the Marxist way of thinking, is dialectical materialism. Thank you.